We're now ready to start developing some more complex examples. But once users start to interact with our apps, we'll occasionally find that we will lose user sessions, causing our apps to crash if we haven't dealt with it. Let's just look at why that might happen and learn how to deal with expired sessions. Sessions, and therefore access tokens associated with those sessions, may expire. This will cause any access tokens which we're using within our code, stored in variables for example, to become invalid. Also, sometimes apps will make use of permissions which allow them to run on a server without the user actually being logged into Facebook. Normally written with the PHP SDK, these apps use an offline access permission which allow the running of regular jobs in the background, for example cron jobs, or other regularly timed scripts to send out emails or to send messages to users of the application. Expired sessions will have a serious effect on these type of applications because any of the access tokens that are stored in databases by these applications and associated with user sessions will become invalid, meaning that even the offline access permissions granted will become meaningless. There are basically 4 reasons why a session may expire. Either 2 hours have passed since the user interacted with the application, the user has logged out of Facebook, where we do not have the offline access permission granted for our PHP script, the user changes their password, or the user removes your application. To avoid being caught out by an expired session, we should monitor for any errors returned by the SDK. In the case of Graph API calls, we may receive an error object back from the Graph API instead of the response we're expecting, with a type of OAuth exception. The message will be different depending upon the reason for expiry, but the important thing is trapping the error type of OAuth exception and knowing how to then deal with the error. In cases where a session has expired, we simply need to redirect the user back to the login URL, using whichever method is appropriate for the SDK we're using. A new session will then be returned, and the request parameters will include a code parameter. If the code parameter is present in the page request, then you know that a new session has been returned, and you'll need to save any stored access tokens, particularly if this is a server script and you've saved them in databases, and you'll need to refresh any access token variables that are used by Graph API calls to make sure you use the new access token and avoid further errors. If the user is logged in and hasn't removed your application or hasn't changed their password and it was simply a session timeout, the login will be silent. You may or may not see a dialog appearing, and the login will happen, the authorization will happen, and you'll retrieve the new access token with no intervention required from the user. If the user has removed your app, they will be prompted to install and accept permissions again. If they've changed their password, they'll be prompted to log in again. And if they're not logged into Facebook, of course they'll be prompted to log into Facebook. If you recall previous examples where we were tracing out the request parameters in the PHP SDK examples, you will remember that we saw a signed request. We may have seen other parameters as well, but no other request parameters relating to sessions were passed into the page. Once the app is reauthorized, we'll see code and state parameters pass through to the page in the request object, denoting that the access token has changed and giving you the clue that you need to resave tokens or refresh tokens stored in variables. Making sure that you deal with expired sessions and retrieve access tokens which have expired is extremely important in production applications. Without it, you'll likely lose users, and the user experience certainly won't be what it could be. Okay, now we have basic JavaScript and PHP SDK example applications. We've learned how to deal with sessions. We've learned how to retrieve access tokens. We basically have the foundation now for building some more complex applications.